All right, so welcome back to my channel called The Young Idealist. And today I have a very special honored guest, actually, who is one of my favorite scholars on Schelling's work. And I invited him here to speak on Schelling because I thought it would be fantastic. Today I have invited to speak Dr. F.W.J. McGrath, who is a full professor of philosophy at Memorial University of Newfoundland and an adjunct professor at McGill's School of Religious Studies. He's published and lectured widely on Heidegger, Schelling, ecology, theology, and psychoanalysis. McGrath is the co-founder of the North American Schelling Society and editor-in-chief at Kabiri, its official journal. He also has a fantastic podcast called The Secular Christ, which I will link the information of this video. And I am holding two of his texts right here that are unbelievable. If you're interested in reading more on Schelling, The Dark Ground of Spirit, Schelling and the Unconscious is a wonderful text, as well as for Schelling's late philosophy, The Philosophical Foundations of the Late Schelling, The Turn to the Positive. So welcome, Sean. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to see you again.
Nice seeing you as well. So part of the reason I'm doing this is that I'm trying to create a digital archive on the history of classical German philosophy and German idealism. So I have two series going on right now. One that's focusing on the Jewish thinkers of this tradition, Maimon, Mendelssohn, Hermann Cohen, Ernest Cassirer, etc. And then another one that's going to trace from Wolff, hopefully, to Schopenhauer. But today we're talking about one of my favorite philosophers, and I think yours as well too, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling. So I was wondering if you could kind of start us off, maybe introduce us to who Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling was as a philosopher, why Schelling is important in the history of German idealism, and why do you think we all should read Schelling today? I know that's a big question, but I thought
so we'll start with his importance and not with his bio then. So Schelling is one of the three great German idealists. There were more than three, but the canon gives us Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. And these three men all knew each other and collaborated quite intensely. And this is part of what makes German idealism such a fruitful area for study, unlike other areas of philosophy where there's little interaction between great thinkers. Here we have three great thinkers who are, actually collaborating at various periods, reading each other, criticizing each other. And I think this has a lot to do with the vitality and power of German idealism. Now, people recount the relationship of these three to each other in different ways, and we get various histories. And there's an old song about Hegel being the pinnacle of this, and Fichte being the beginning of it, and Schelling being the middle. I'm not even sure that that's particularly widely held anymore. I'm not even sure that it's worth our time debunking it. I think these three figures, really, each of them are equal in their contribution to German idealism. And in some respects, there would be no German idealism without one of them. So Schelling is not a transitional figure, but neither is Fichte. And certainly Hegel never was, never considered to be one. These three were collaborators, to some degree friends, contemporaries who collaborated in producing probably what has been described as the most fertile period in speculative philosophy and metaphysics since the Golden Age of Athens. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I think Schelling's position in this history amongst these three is to have been sort of the beginning and the end of it all. He was literally the beginning in the sense that he was one of Fichte's early collaborators and one of the first to really take Fichte's position and expand it into something much bigger than Fichte even imagined. Fichte, as we know, thought he was just continuing the Kantian critique, and Schelling said, on the contrary, what you're doing is you're giving us a new metaphysics. And that inspired that move inspired. And then Schelling was, of course, the one to close the tradition, the last. He outlived Hegel and Fichte, and was the last great German idealist on the throne in Berlin, so to speak, in 1841. where he outlined his positive philosophy, about which we might say some things. So he really begins and ends the thing. I like to think of Schopenhauer as kind of a postscript. Schopenhauer is extremely important, of course, but he can't really be included amongst these three in the same sense, because he is so critical of their foundational positions and their orientations. Schopenhauer is really the denouement, and when you read Schopenhauer, you can see, you can hear Nietzsche, you can hear Freud, you can hear the beginning of the disenchantment of the world. None of those themes really are found so clearly in the German idealists. So Schelling is the German idealist of German idealists. How about that?
That's wonderful. That's great, actually. I really liked your answer. I was just wondering if you could maybe give us a brief biography of Schelling's life and maybe highlight some of the more important events that went through his life.
Well, he lived a long time, so I can't really talk about the whole life, but we can at least say where it begins and where it ends and what the key moments are in the middle. So he was born in 1775 in Leonberg, which is in southern Germany. And I think the reason this is important is that this area of southern Germany was the birthplace, really, of classical German 19th century German philosophy. So many of the great, in fact, so many of the great German philosophers came out of a certain Christian, what we call pietist tradition. And this was definitely the case with Schelling. He was born into a pietist family. His father was a pastor, a professor, a well-known and renowned professor of the Old Testament and a Hebrew scholar. And Schelling came from a long line of pastors. And this family understood itself to be firmly established in the pietistic tradition. And in fact, a special branch of pietism called speculative pietism. And this pietism had an immense influence on Schelling. He didn't remain affiliated with any particular church in his life, but one can see the influence of pietism all throughout his career. In fact, it returns even more powerfully towards the end of his career. So he was precocious, brilliant, actually. And he, for example, enrolled in the seminary at Tübingen at the age of 15, when the standard age of enrollment was 20. So he was way ahead of his time in many ways, and everybody sort of recognized that he was the Wunderkind, he was the genius among them. For example, at the age of 19 in 1794, he wrote a treatise on the Timaeus, which wasn't published in his lifetime, which people still read today because it is so rich with insight into both ancient philosophy and the relationship of ancient philosophy to modern philosophy. In 1795, he started his publishing career at the age of 20. And I often say this to my undergrads, which causes them to feel, what shall I say, self-conscious about their achievements. How does it make me feel? I'm 56. Nevertheless, at 20, he starts this extraordinary publishing career where treatise after treatise comes out between 1795 and 1800. I can't even keep track of them. I don't even know, is it 4 or 5? They're major treatises flowing from his pen. Everybody's starting to take notice of them. And out of this publishing kind of we'd almost call it a ecstasy or something. It's hysteric, really. He's over publishing, but nevertheless, he gets the notice of people like Goethe, and was given a professorship at the University of Vienna at a very young age, at the age of 23, in fact. And it was at Jena. Jena was sort of the hotspot for the birth, for the, well, perhaps not the birth, but let's say the flowering of German Romanticism. And there was Schelling at the center of it. He was Fichte's colleague. He became friends with the Schlegel brothers. He knew Novalis, he knew Schleiermacher. Jena was a place of intense ferment, kind of like Athens in the 4th century. And Schelling was directly at the center of all those things. His work at that time was predominantly nature philosophy, and that we might talk a little bit about what that means, but one of the reasons he became so popular is that there was such a hunger for a return to a robust theory of nature after Cartesianism, mechanism, and the transcendental philosophical move of Kant, which seems to have in a certain way rescued science but left us without nature in a curious way. Schelling, and at the same time, the romantics, the poets, becoming more and more dissatisfied with Enlightenment rationalism, more and more convinced that the human being is at root inspired and maybe driven and determined and doomed by irrational forces, and that in nature it finds its own adequate reflection in the infinity of nature, the infinity of forms of nature, which will never be calculatively managed or manipulated by human beings and cannot even be fully fathomed. This kind of romantic enthusiasm back to nature movement met Schelling at exactly the right time. Or perhaps I should say it the other way around. Schelling met that moment at exactly the right time and offered the Romantic generation a robust philosophy of nature that was not reductive and seemed to have healed the breach between the human and the natural, and inspired the poets to consider, to recognize that their intuition, that there was an infinity to nature, that this intuition was actually based on that could be justified rigorously philosophically. So that was his early career, and it comes to its end rather quickly. That's typical, I think, of these early bloomers, is that they often descend into obscurity pretty quickly too, and that certainly happened to Schelling. He moved to Munich in 1806. That was a big move for Schelling, because he more or less stayed in Munich until he left for Berlin in 1841. There was a period there where he was teaching at Erlangen, but he had 2 Munich periods. But to keep things clear, we'll just say that the bulk of Schelling's life before he goes to Berlin in 1841 was in Munich. And in Munich, he befriended Franz von Baader. And this is the beginning of the second major phase of Schelling's thought, which is the philosophy of religion. So I like to think of Schelling's career as kind of divided into 2. Schelling 1 is the nature philosophy, not philosophy of nature. And Schelling 2 is philosophy of religion, not religious philosophy. These two are connected by an extraordinary piece of writing, which he published in 1809, called The Freedom Essay, Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, which really is his most famous work. It's a short piece, but it's a beloved text, and it has influenced many, many great thinkers. But that turned out to be his last major publication. And in 1810, his beloved muse, Carolina, who was some 10 years his senior, Carolina Schlegel, died, and he was completely destroyed by this death. He could not continue to work. He crashed badly. He began, dabbling in the occult to try to keep contact with her. And it's also at this period that his thinking became much more religiously oriented. It is not as though he was indifferent to religious matters before. Of course, he was trained in theology, but the religious never really preoccupied him philosophically prior to 1809 like it did afterwards. And then Schelling more or less disappears into obscurity because Hegel's star rises. Hegel, who was his understudy, becomes famous with the publication of the Phenomenology of Spirit, and enters into a polemic with Schellingian philosophy. And Hegel becomes more and more the philosopher of the time, and Schelling becomes a bureaucrat. He works for the Munich government, essentially. He's the secretary for the Academy of Fine Arts, and his job is really to introduce art installations and this kind of thing, and give a lecture when he can here and there. More or less disappears from the limelight, except for circles of students who remained with them, because he was lecturing all through that period, often lecturing just as a kind of adjunct lecturer, as he was at Erlangen, until all this changes when Hegel dies in 1831, and the German idealist period seems to be winding down, and Hegel's chair in Berlin was left deliberately open by the King of Prussia, because the king did not want a Hegelian in that chair. He wanted Hegelianism to stop. He thought Hegelianism was the enemy of Christendom, and that it was bringing and it was ruining the culture and dragging Germany into the direction of a kind of French Republic and French secularism and atheism and so on. And so there was no way that the regime was going to support more Hegelianism. So the chair was left open for a decade, until finally high-level negotiations between two kings, the Prussian king and the Bavarian king, brought Schelling to Berlin with a new position again now, a full position of, in fact, the highest paid position in the history of the German university, where he inaugurated how should we say, he had been lecturing on philosophy of revelation before that, but now it became a big public event. And at that point, of course, he was an old man. And then he died in 1854.
Well, thank you very much for that very rich answer. There are some things that I didn't know that I actually learned in that. So thank you very much for that. This is going to be one of my favorite questions to ask you because I absolutely adore your work and all of your research. Who do you think are some of Schelling's early and late influences in his philosophical career?
I've been thinking about this question, and of course, we could give a very big answer to it. Would have people like Leibniz in there, and God knows who else. But I'd be inclined to give it a much leaner answer, because I think we'll maintain a focus on what's unique about Schelling when we see that his influences were in some respects kind of singular. That is, there weren't too many people at the time who blended the kinds of things that Schelling put together the way that he did. I shouldn't say that, really. They were all sort of doing that. Scratch that. Wipe that from the record. Here are the big influences. First, pietism. And among the pietists, or among pietist authors or authors that were read by pietists, we would have to include Jakob Böhme, who was a massive influence, but also his 18th century spokesperson, Friedrich Christoph Oettinger, whom Schelling read as a young person. And through pietism, the Kabbalah. Now, in those days, the Kabbalah was not something you could Google up. You weren't even allowed near it. So Schelling couldn't directly read the Kabbalah. Even later on, when he became a researcher of the Kabbalah, he had to have a mediator who was a rabbi, Molitor, sort of bringing the Kabbalah to him, because the Kabbalah was understood to be something that was not for the infidel, was not for the uninitiated. But the Kabbalah was, in the Renaissance period, Christianized, and Böhme and Oettinger were part of this Christian Kabbalah. And the Christian Kabbalah was a way in which the doctrine of the Trinity and the Kabbalistic insight that God reveals God's self in creation were brought together. And that had a huge influence on Schelling, bigger than I think has been properly recognized to date. The second big influence would be transcendental philosophy, and that would be Kant and Fichte. It's striking that to the end of his career, Schelling is convinced that his work is, at least, does not contradict Kant. Unlike Hegel, who found Kant to be full of errors, Schelling always held up Kant as, in some respects, the last word on a certain kind of philosophy. When he was introducing his philosophy of revelation in Berlin, and the students asked him, what should we read to prepare for your lecture? He said, read the Critique of Pure Reason. So that's the other big influence. And I think the third, this is going to sound ridiculous because it's so broad, but I don't know how else to put it. The third influence is the Greeks and the Jews. That is the polar beginning of our tradition in these two cultures out of antiquity. One, Hellenism, as it comes forward out of Greek philosophy, and Schelling was a great scholar of Plato and Aristotle. But the other, it's Hebraic alternative, it's Hebraic opposite. And Schelling, uniquely, I think, among his contemporaries, was a scholar of Hebrew, and recognized that there was something very distinctive and crucially Western coming forward out of the Hebraic tradition that the Greeks, that we could not trace to the Greeks. And so this Greek and Jewish, or this bipolar, if that's the right word, origin of the Western tradition in antiquity is the other major influence in his thought.
So Jerusalem and Athens, reason and
That's right.
revelation.
Yes. And, Schelling is the thinker of opposites. So you never, opposition is only possible between two of the same kind. And so there's no tearing an opposite together. So if the Greek and the Jew are opposites, then they belong inseparably together. And that is because they have a common origin, which is can't be reduced to either of them. And I think this is very central to Schelling's thought. It might even help us understand why there's always two philosophies in Schelling, right to the very end,
Thank you for that. And I'm really glad that we're at this point where we're talking about the Greek tradition and the Jewish tradition. And now I can ask you, how important do you think Christianity as a religion is to Schelling's philosophy as a whole?
Now, this is a difficult question. So we said, yes. So Schelling is full of disputed questions. The Schelling scholarship is full of disputed questions. There's very little consensus on anything in Schelling. He really is a protean thinker, and he doesn't have a major work, and he doesn't have a single philosophy. And all of this can lead people to think he's not an important thinker, but it's exactly the reverse. As Hegel said, he's a thinker of the way. Heidegger said he's a thinker of the way. Philosophy for him is a living activity, and it's not something that can be kind of settled down into a book and packaged up and said, this is my position and I shall now defend it for the rest of my life. So this has led to an immense plurality in the reception of Schelling. So I can only give you my position on this, but I just want it to be foreground my recognition that many people disagree with it, including some of my favorite Schelling scholars and my best friends. So this is just McGrath. So for McGrath, there's two Schellings. There has to be two Schellings. These thinker polarity. And the first Schelling is the Schelling of nature philosophy. As we said, this goes up to 1809. Nature philosophy, not philosophy of nature. This is not the philosophy that objectifies nature and stands over and against it like a scientific thinker. This is the philosophy that, recognizing the fallacy in that dyad, that dualism, this is the philosophy that philosophizes out of nature. Philosophy that begins with the recognition that philosophy is an expression of nature. Philosophy is nature philosophizing about itself. And so that's nature philosophy. And in the second period of his career, in the Schelling II, these two Schellings are the hinges, the freedom essay, in which we can find both of these tendencies equally present. The second period is the philosophy of religion, not religious philosophy. That is, Schelling flirts a little bit with religious philosophy, and then he pulls himself out at the end, and he recognizes, no. In order to have written a religious philosophy, philosophy would have had to finally arrived at its position, at its goal, so to speak, and become oracular, become some possessed of the truth. And since Schelling is a historical thinker, he does not think we are there yet. And so it has to be philosophy of religion, if you like, objective genitive. Religion has to be an object for philosophy, and philosophy has to distantiate itself from religion if it's going to do the philosophy of religion responsibly. So the philosophy of religion that Schelling does is the philosophy of Christianity, because for Schelling, as for Hegel, Christianity is the consummate religion. It is the pinnacle of religious development in a certain way, a certain stage of religious development. Schelling, unlike Hegel, thinks there's another stage for religion still to come, but at least in terms of what's on, what has been produced in human history, we cannot go higher and further. We have not reached higher and gone further than in Christianity. So Christianity is its object. Now, this means that Schelling is doing a non-confessional philosophy of Christianity. And this is really important, because one of the reasons I think people don't read the late Schelling carefully is because they confuse this point. They believe that Schelling has turned confessional, that now he's becoming pious, or now he's allowing a religious position to answer philosophical questions or something like that. All the various ways in which philosophers have always objected to religious philosophy. This is not what Schelling is doing with Christianity at all. What he's doing is far more interesting. He is in a certain way, religious philosophers like myself wish that Schelling was more of a religious philosopher. Where's Schelling's soul? Where's his confession? Where's his faith? It's really not in. It's not there. We don't see it. He seems to be entirely objective in his approach to Christianity, and I take this to be actually something that's deeply Schellingian generally. He's a philosopher of objectivity from the beginning to the end. He dislikes subjectivism intensely, and for him, a religious philosophy that confuses its own faith and sentiments and experiences with the scientific matter at issue, namely, does God exist? Is there a life after death? So on, is of no help whatsoever. So Schelling's approach to Christianity is to approach Christianity as an objective matter. And it's not just one objective matter among many. It's not like, oh, well, we have Buddhism and Islam and all these interesting religious things. Let's have a look at Christianity. No, it is the matter of the West. We go back to the Greeks and the Jews. It is in Christianity that the Greek and the Jewish opposite are synthesized. Moreover, for Schelling, and in this regard, he is definitely ahead of his time, the modern Western philosophical project is determined in innumerable ways by Christianity. Not that it's irrational, but rather that it wouldn't be what it was had it not emerged out of Christendom, both positively and negatively. He doesn't go into great detail on these topics, but I would think, for example, that it wouldn't be hard to get Schelling to recognize that the notion of freedom itself would not be a theme for modern philosophy had it not been for Christianity. The notion of progress, for example, the sense for individualism, positively or negatively, or personalism, or even the sense for love as agape and not just eros. All of these basic themes of modern Western philosophical ethics, philosophical metaphysics, are themes only because philosophy has is foregrounded in religion, and it's foregrounded in a particular religion. You could say that Western philosophy is the product of Christianity, and therefore Christianity needs to be thematized philosophically, much more so than it has been. Not theologically, but philosophically. That is, we need to consider the possibility that Christianity is true in some fundamental sense, far more fundamental sense than any of his colleagues would have attributed to it. That is that the Christianity is a doctrine of history, and it refers to certain historical events, and these events we need to consider them as we need to ask ourselves, what would be the case if, in fact, the Gospels were true? That is, if these things actually happened, a man actually rose from the dead, and if he was actually revealed not to be just a man, but to be God amongst us, how should we think everything from science to ethics to history in the light of the possibility that these things are true? The possibility. Schelling doesn't say they're necessarily true. They must be true because the Bible told me so, or because I've always believed it. No, rather it's a hypothesis. And the reasonableness of the hypothesis, or the non-arbitrary nature of it, is that the Christian mythos, if you want to call it that, but Christianity is not a myth, but we'll say mythos. The Christian mythos has so determines Western rationality, that Western rationality is inseparable from it. And so for Western philosophy not to ask the question about the truth of Christianity would be for Western rationality to be unreasonable, to be irrational. Sorry, that was a complete mess. Nevertheless, you get the point, I hope.
No, absolutely. I was going to say something. That was not a complete mess. That was fantastic. In the Dark Ground of Spirit, there's a line where you're talking about the three potencies and the ages of the world. And this got me really thinking. This is when I realized that there was really something here that you were expressing. You mentioned this idea that Schelling takes a theosophical idea and turns it into nice, concrete philosophical concepts. And I think that that comment has stuck with me this entire time since I've read that text, actually.
Yeah. So what can you say more about that? Why does that seem important to you?
It's important to me because if one were to simply just take Schelling's philosophy at bay, without really doing the work, without understanding it, you know, the Freiheitsschrift, and even philosophy and religion, they're very poetic in writing, and when you need to unpack these for Schelling, and I think especially in the logic of the freedom essay, ground, existence, und Grund, the element where he's talking about the receptacle, or the moments where he's talking about this kind of unknown, nameless good that swirling around like a wave wound whirling sea, and such imagery, I think, when he's talking about these issues, if we need to look at its root, and I think he really is taking a kind of Neoplatonic and Burmian kind of element, but also drawing out his own conceptual schema from it. If that
No, that's exactly right. So theosophy is not well understood now because the term has been taken over by a group that has nothing to do with what Boehme called theosophy. But what Schelling understood by it, and what Boehme understood by it, was that this was not philosophy but a theosophy. So it was not the love of wisdom, but it was the wisdom of God. So it was somehow revealed, or it was a gnosis. There's a claim to some kind of supra-rational knowledge in every theosophical text, and for Schelling, that will never do in philosophy. So in this regard, Schelling is completely on board with Hegel when he says, he speaks about Sunday's children, and essentially, Chris, if I tell you that I just saw the Virgin Mary walking around in the meadow, all you could say was, "How that's grand," but that doesn't change anything for me, and I have no reason to think differently about anything else. My experiences are just my experiences. In order for them to become philosophical, they have to be exoteric, Hegel says, and I think Schelling is completely on board with that, and perhaps he's probably even stronger on it than Hegel. That is, that a matter that might be compelling on some kind of mystical grounds, or some kind of confession that comes from an extraordinary figure like Boehme, cannot be simply left as it is if it's to be of any use in philosophy. It has to be converted in a certain way. It has to be translated to the degree that it can into philosophical terms. And what that means is we have to give reasons for these things. We have to show that what is claimed, it'd be one thing to say we can prove it apodictically, but failing that, we can at least say, there are reasons for thinking that this might be the case. And that's what he does with theosophy in the middle period, and it's what he's trying to do with Christian dogma at the end. He's a great believer in the principle of sufficient reason. He doesn't like people saying things on the basis of mysticism, and it's for this reason that this is one of the great injustices that have been done to Schelling by the Hegelians, not so much by Hegel, but by the Hegelians, who think he's the mystic. In fact, it's the opposite. In fact, Hegel is far more enthusiastic about mysticism than Schelling is. When Franz von Bader says, "Hey, Hegel, you're saying basically what Eckhart says," Hegel gets so excited that he gives a lecture on Eckhart and starts incorporating it into his work, and says, "Indeed, this is precisely what Eckhart is saying. This is the heart of genuine mysticism, my speculative philosophy." When Schelling approaches mysticism, it is with great suspicion that here we have something that is in principle not philosophical, and to enthusiastically accept it is to overturn the whole philosophical project.
Well, thank you for that. I think you're really bringing all of these concepts to life, and every time I hear you speak about Schelling, whether it's the passion in your eyes or the tone or the argument. You always seem to bring Schelling to life, which is one of the reasons why I invited you here to speak. So one of my next question is, how important are the concepts of freedom, personality, and revelation in Schelling's philosophy? And how do you think he utilizes all three?
Freedom, personality, and revelation.
Well, we can say personalism.
Yeah. Well, let's start with freedom. I think freedom is the biggest of the three. Schelling is the philosopher of freedom from the beginning to the end. He was a philosopher of freedom in his nature philosophy period. It was always on his mind, but he had to get out of nature philosophy to really get freedom, to really put freedom on secure philosophical grounds. He had to move into the transcendental philosophical key, because Kant, nobody had clarified freedom more than Kant, particularly in his ethical work, and then to move beyond Kant into a metaphysics of freedom. So I think freedom is Schelling's great thought, and it's not the freedom of the individual; it's freedom as the ground of being. That is his astonishing idea. There's a passage in the Urfassung of the Philosophy of Revelation where Schelling says, "Freedom is the highest, both for us and for God." So there's nothing higher than freedom, and freedom in this sense would not be the capacity to do this or that. Although he does say, of course, for freedom in the human is the capacity for good and for evil, but ultimately freedom has to be more than this, and it's not easy to understand what it would mean to make freedom higher than God. But we could say this, that Schelling 1 naturalizes freedom and he frees nature. That is, Schelling 1, Schelling the nature philosopher, endeavors or perhaps succeeds in demonstrating that freedom is a product of nature. That nature should be conceived such that it could, one of its products, one of its natural evolutionary effects would be free beings such as ourselves, asking the question, what is nature? So he naturalizes freedom, but he also frees nature in a certain way, because nature, that it could produce freedom, cannot be mechanistic, it cannot be deterministic, it has to have something far more profoundly open at its ground, than the positivist, a positive account would allow us to think. Now, Schelling 2 is the philosopher of religion, and you could say in a certain way that freedom kind of retreats a little bit from the foreground, but it's still there in the background, quite powerfully so. But what Schelling 2 is really tracking is divinity, much more directly than he does in the nature philosophy. In fact, in the nature philosophy, Schelling is frankly quite unclear on what divinity is. Is divinity nature? Is divinity just possibility? Is divinity just a manner of speaking? In this, Schelling 2 moves directly into this frame of questioning and asks the question of God, the God question. And we could say that what he does, if we were to continue with this parallelism, is that Schelling 2 philosophizes divinity. That is, he insists on a purely philosophical approach to the question of divinity, and he divinizes philosophy. He divinizes the philosophy, which is to say, he doesn't make philosophy revelation, but rather he makes philosophy, he makes the telos of philosophy, the end goal of philosophy, nothing less than union with divinity, or restoration of the lost divine. Yes. So I'm not sure if that touches the three of them. With regard to the personal, there's a difficult thing, Schelling says at one point in the Freedom essay, we have articulated the first theory of personality. And this comes it just comes out of left field, because at that point he'd been talking about everything, the birth of God from the unground, the dark ground, in some kind of rebellion against the being, and then finding itself entangled in evil unless it subordinates itself to being. And we're in this wild mythopoetic register, and he sort of takes a breath and says, we've articulated the first theory of personality. So this is extremely puzzling, and it's extremely profound. And I don't know what we can say about it quickly, other than that for Schelling, the person is higher than the individual. The person is not simply a fait accompli. It's not by virtue of being born human that you're going to achieve personhood. Personhood is in a certain way, a task. It's always an achievement of freedom. It's never a given. It's not necessary that we become persons. It is the fundamental challenge of human beings. And in certain respects, it has to do with a kind of subordination of our individuality to the good. But this subordination has to be so entirely our subordination, nothing universal about it, unscalable, our unique way of let's say, embodying the personality of being, that it's not something that could be taught. It's not something that you can write a book about. It's not something that Kant has given us the clue to with the categorical imperative. So personalization is the whole reason why there's something rather than nothing. And now we could connect it to the business of revelation. So the philosophy of religion of Schelling is the philosophy of revelation. And the philosophy of revelation is the philosophy of history, the positive philosophy. That is, history understood as progressive, ongoing revelation of God. Good. Others have said similar things. Schelling adds, though, that this revelation of God is not just the unveiling of something always already accomplished, divinity having eternally infinite and good, but progressively revealing itself in history. On the contrary, Schelling says, no, something is going on with God, and what's going on with God is what is being revealed. That is, and here you see further Schelling's deeply desubjectifying, de-anthropocentric attitude. History is not our story, as Hegel would assume, perhaps everybody else. Rather, history is God's story, and we're caught up in it. We're kind of supporting actors in a drama that precedes us, and exceeds us. We're very important to the drama, we're essential to it. But something is going on, and what is going on is that God is becoming personal. To put very complicated matters in a simple form, God is becoming personal in history, in creation, and that is what revelation is.
I thought of this question because the last time that I saw you, other than the ISNA event, was at NAS 7, where you began this brilliant talk of yours on personalism, and you said a message to all the Schellingians, which I thought was very profound. You said, Schellingians are philosophers of freedom. So, but at the same time, freedom from what? Freedom from Schelling. And you said, reading Schelling, you have to find your own self through Schelling's work. And I thought that was absolutely profound. So I wanted to ask you this question as well, because that comment that you made, but also the whole point of personalism and revelation. So thank you so much for giving such a rich answer to that.
And if I might just add something to that comment, this is one of the things that's so extraordinary about Schelling. And here I think my colleagues who have very different views on Schelling, I always think of two of my favorite Schellingians, Ian Hamilton Grant on the one side, Jason Wirth on the other. Ian Hamilton Grant, it's all nature philosophy. Jason Wirth, it's the philosophy of mythology, maybe with a bit of, Jason is quite open to the Christian element, but it's not really his thing. So we have these, I have these two on either side of me, two wonderful friends and brilliant Schelling scholars who are taking different elements of Schelling and working it through. But I think we could all agree, and I know that we all have, and I think most Schellingians will agree, that one of the things that they love about Schelling is that he doesn't just leave us free, he makes us free. He commands us to think freely. And this used to be his great weakness, right? He's the protean, he couldn't write a system. He was carried out his education in public. But in fact, it is working with Schelling's texts drives you to philosophize. You can't add it up. It doesn't turn into one big system that you can represent at meetings with other people who know the system just as well as you. You've got to take a position within it. And that's why the Schellingians are so unique amongst themselves. The ones who have really gone the distance for it, they really become themselves through Schelling, because Schelling requires us to philosophize differently than he himself is working. Yeah, that's sort of like Socrates in that regard. I really find Schelling and Socrates, definitely the Socrates of the dialogues of Plato, not necessarily the historical Socrates, but just the aporia becoming a kind of creative space in which possibilities for thought and possibilities for philosophies emerge. I think that's very Schellingian. You also see the freedom with method too in Socrates. I'll give you a dialectical argument, and when that's done, I'm going to tell you a story. And this is very Schellingian, to alternate between poetry, mythology, narration, strict dialectical proofs, logic, all in the interest of working something through in a situation where the end is not known. This is the thing. We're in a fundamentally undetermined situation. He's a philosopher of indeterminacy. It's not clear where things are going, and it's not clear what things really are, and possibility is everywhere. And so we can't simply to speak as though things are more settled than they are is to speak in a way that's not adequate to reality.
I absolutely agree, 100%. That was fantastic. I was just wondering, what are you currently working on right now? I know you said you're away, you're up in the mountains somewhere. That I use that saying because I had a friend, and when I was doing my master's, and anytime when we were writing our MRPs, we used to say, we're up in the mountains, we're away, we're working on writing this out. So what are you currently working on right now?
Well, I'm not in fact in the mountains. I'm right on the sea, but on a hill, let's say, overlooking the sea in Newfoundland. And I have the sequel to the Turn to the Positive, which I announced in the Turn to the Positive, drafted, and it sits in my computer. In fact, the book was like it was much longer, and I broke it into two and published chose to publish two parts. So that's the speculative theology of the late Schelling, and it's entirely concerned with Schelling's Christology and his doctrine of the Trinity. And I decided to separate these two for various reasons, but perhaps one of the best reasons to separate them is that inevitably not everybody who's interested in, let's say, some of the fundamental arguments in the Turn to the Positive, formal arguments, logical arguments, metaphysical arguments, will be interested in Schelling's readings of Christian dogma, because they perhaps will not necessarily believe that Christianity is as central to philosophy as Schelling thinks it is. So I wanted to work on the Trinitarian and Christological elements in Schelling. So there's a big project, and there's a lot of people working on it now. Translations are coming out, so it's probably a good thing that I delayed it, because I've got to go into the patristics in a way that I've never have before, because Schelling knows his Greek fathers really well. And so there's nothing cursory about his treatment of Trinity and Christology. So I'm trying to sort out exactly who Schelling is with respect to the great Christological debates of the 5th century. Yeah, that's one project, and I don't know when it's going to be finished. But in the foreground, I have a couple other things that are coming to completion, including I've got a book of theology, political theology, coming out this year called Political Eschatology, and it's a set of essays on contemporary political problems, and it is addressing these essays explicitly from a political theological perspective and a Christian perspective and a Christian eschatological perspective. That is, taking the stance that others have taken, that Christianity is, from the beginning to the end, a philosophy of the end times, a religion of the end times, a religion that situates the believer on the brink of the end of something and the beginning of something completely different. So that's the essays on political eschatology. And thirdly, unfortunately, I seem to be a bit Schellingian in my scattered work. I have a product, I have a sequel to the Dark Ground of Spirit also underway, which is called The Dissociative Self. And it will be mostly revised things that I have published here and there in the area of psychoanalysis and philosophical psychology in the last decade. But I'm trying to bring it together I'm trying to bring it together and frame it in such a way as to say, look, these are not just scattered remarks, but they do hang together in a certain way. And there's a vision of the self that is, I think, neither Freudian nor Jungian nor Lacanian that organizes these thoughts.
When you said you were doing a sequel to the Dark Ground of Spirit, I felt like Kierkegaard at Schellings lectures when you said Wirklichkeit or actuality. I was like jumping. That sounds great. I'm very excited about that. You have no idea how good this video coming out is, because I actually asked Ryan Baker, who's a theologian at the American University of Rome, to talk about the patristic sources in German idealism. And him and I recorded a video on this, actually. So this will come out first, and then Brian's video. Yeah,
I look forward to hearing that.
But thank you so much for coming here, for giving us such rich ideas and bringing all of these concepts to life, and really giving us this passionate Schelling. And he was here with us today as we were discussing all these ideas. It was fantastic. So I have to thank you so much for being a part of this project.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for all you do for keeping German idealism on multiple fronts, particularly the social media front, which is not always, not everybody can do that. So you're doing a great job with that. So I much appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great time. Have a great day. Sorry, and look forward to all of the new stuff that's coming out.
Thanks, Chris. Have a good day yourself. Take care.
Thank you.